Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are mapping out what I like to call a taxonomy of madness. We're going to be exploring the absolute darkest, weirdest, and frankly most foolish corners of scientific history. You know, we so often put scientists on this massive pedestal, right? We view them as these ultimate beacons of rationality. But what happens when the relentless pursuit of knowledge collides head-on with breathtaking arrogance and, honestly, a complete lack of common sense? Well, buckle up, because we are about to look at the visionaries who bypassed logic, totally ignored basic safety, and crossed lines you wouldn't even think imaginable, all in the name of science. Okay, let's dive into this by challenging a really fundamental assumption, the idea that brilliant minds always make smart choices. Because the truth is, sometimes the only difference between a revered scientific pioneer and a totally forgotten cautionary tale is just dumb luck. We really like to think that earning a place in the history books requires this spotless, perfect intellect. But as you're about to see, surviving your own crackpot experiment? Yeah, sometimes that's just a complete fluke.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover number 1, the myth of genius, 2, lethal self-experimentation, 3, animal kingdom atrocities, 4, ethically bankrupt psychology, and finally 5, fatal errors in judgment.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the myth of genius, foundational fools. We're going to look at some early, highly respected pioneers who helped build the very foundations of modern science, yet met completely avoidable and often deeply ironic ends.
Just consider these two towering historical figures for a second. First up, Francis Bacon. He's literally one of the fathers of empiricism, right? Well, he had a brilliant idea back in 1626. What if ice could preserve meat? So he goes out, stands in the freezing snow, stuffs a plucked chicken with ice, and promptly catches pneumonia and dies. I mean, he was absolutely right about the chicken, but his self-preservation skills were practically non-existent. Then there's Georg Wilhelm Richmann. This guy was a physicist so influential, he literally has a physical law named after him. He invented a device to capture lightning, and well, it worked a little too well. It produced this dazzling orb of ball lightning that immediately struck him right in the head, blew a hole through his shoe, and instantly fried him. Both of these brilliant men literally became victims of their own poorly planned physical experiments.
But, this phenomenon isn't just limited to the distant past or reckless men. Marie Curie was an undeniable genius. She's one of the few people to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields. But her groundbreaking research into elements like radium and polonium came at a truly devastating personal cost. By 1934, she passed away from aplastic anemia, which was directly caused by her lifelong exposure to radiation. And to put that into perspective, her exposure was so severe, she actually had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. Even today, literally a century later, her lab equipment remains dangerously radioactive. It's just a really sobering reminder of the lethal price of scientific advancement.
Moving right along to Section 2, lethal self-experimentation, guinea pig scientists. Let's pivot over to the scientists who decided to bypass animal testing entirely and use their own bodies as the ultimate laboratory, usually with pretty horrific results.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the escalating staircase of grotesqueness that was Stubbins Firth's methodology. Back in the early 1800s, he really wanted to prove that yellow fever couldn't be transmitted through bodily fluids. So, to prove it, he cut his own arms and poured actual patient vomit into the open wounds. When he didn't get sick, he doubled down. He poured the puke directly into his own eyeballs. And finally, for his grand finale, he just drank it undiluted. He didn't get sick, so he declared his hypothesis correct. But here is the tragic punchline. His experiment was completely, utterly useless. Yellow fever is mosquito-borne. Firth was using fluids from late-stage patients whose bodies no longer even contain the active virus. All that grossness for literally nothing. Speaking of yellow fever, let's contrast Fist off with Dr. Jesse William Lazier. Lazier actually hypothesized that mosquitoes were the vector for the disease, and to prove it definitively, he let infected mosquitoes bite him. He contracted the disease and died 2 weeks later. It was a deadly sacrifice, but his hypothesis was completely spot on. On the flip side, we have Alexander Bogdanov. He was a brilliant pioneer in blood transfusions who somehow thought that a transfusion with a 21-year-old student suffering from tuberculosis would magically rejuvenate his own aging body. Bogdanov actually believed his own blood was somehow immune and would cure the student. Instead, Bogdanov died a completely preventable death from a massive hemolytic reaction. The student, ironically enough, made a full recovery. Lazier died for a correct hypothesis, Bogdanov died for a completely misguided vanity project.
And then there is Joseph Barcroft. This guy was a hardcore military researcher studying oxygenation, and his methodology was absolutely deranged. I mean, he walked straight into a sealed chamber filled with hydrogen cyanide gas and just stayed there for 10 solid minutes. Later on, he locked himself in a freezer until he flat out passed out from hypothermia. And for his grand finale, he spent a solid week in a low oxygen chamber until his skin literally turned bright blue. Now, we don't call Barcroft an idiot solely because he happened to survive, but make no mistake, his survival was a complete statistical improbability for someone acting so recklessly.
All right, Section 3, Animal Kingdom Atrocities, Bridging the Divide. Here, we're stepping into the really dark territory where researchers involved animals with absolutely zero common sense and honestly, even less regard for any sort of ethical boundaries. Comparative psychologist Winthrop Kellogg had this burning question. What would actually happen if you raised a baby chimpanzee right alongside a human baby? So, in 1931, he brought a chimp named Gua into his home to be raised right alongside his own infant son, Donald. The whole goal was to see if the chimp would become more human. But this backfired terribly. While Gua learned to use a spoon and wear clothes, she hit a hard physiological wall. She obviously couldn't speak. But baby Donald? Yeah, he actually started repeating the chimp noises. Kellogg quickly pulled the plug when he realized his own human child was devolving into a chimp much faster than the chimp was evolving into a human. 297 milligrams. That staggering number represents an incredible, heartbreaking failure of basic math and scientific judgment. Researchers at the University of Oklahoma wanted to see what would happen if they gave LSD to an elephant. They took Tusco, a beautiful, large male Indian elephant, and injected him with 297 milligrams. To put that into perspective for you, that is approximately 3,000 times the typical human recreational dose. It was a wildly, tragically miscalculated experiment. Tusco collapsed in 5 minutes and was dead within 2 hours.
And sadly, Tusco wasn't an isolated incident. Science history is just littered with what we can only call the taxonomy of the absurd. Ready for this? We have Dr. Ivanov trying to breed human-chimp hybrids, Duncan McDougall weighing dying patients to see if the human soul weighed exactly 21 grams, researchers literally lurking in public bathrooms to see if stage fright delays urination, Hans Horberger claiming all reality is bound by cosmic ice, scientists strapping artificial dinosaur tails onto chickens, researchers feeding chopped-up flatworms to other flatworms to prove memory is chemical, doctors injecting cow's milk into human veins instead of blood, biohackers dropping blindness medication into healthy eyes just for night vision. And oh man, let's not forget the scientists who literally stacked heavy weights onto their own testicles for the betterment of human knowledge. It's just a rapid-fire list of completely bizarre, often fabricated or entirely pointless scientific pursuits.
Let's move on to Section 4, Ethically Bankrupt Psychology, Mind Games. We're transitioning away from physical torture and looking at the psychological damage inflicted in the name of behavioral science.
Just imagine being a young boy at a summer camp in 1942. You're trying to fall asleep, and a shadowy figure creeps into your cabin, repeating the phrase, "My fingernails taste terribly bitter," hundreds and hundreds of times. Sounds like a horror movie, right? Well, this actually happened. Professor Lawrence LeShan was testing the now completely debunked theory of sleep learning. When his automated phonograph broke, he personally snuck into the cabins of chronic nail-biters to whisper this creepy phrase in the dark himself. It wasn't science, it was just incredibly disturbing, boundary-crossing behavior. But that creepy whispering honestly seems mild compared to this next terrifying number, 45%. That was the surgical mortality rate achieved by Dr. Henry Cotton at the New Jersey State Hospital for the Insane in the early 1900s. See, he developed this wild, baseless theory that all mental illness was caused by hidden physical infections. So, his brilliant solution? Start yanking things out. He pulled the decayed teeth of his patients, and when that didn't cure their delusions, he progressively escalated. He started removing their tonsils, testicles, ovaries, and even their colons. His patients had a survival rate that ended up making his operating table exactly as deadly as a coin toss.
You know, even the pillars of introductory psychology textbooks completely crumble under scrutiny. Take John Watson's famous Little Albert study. He introduced a baby to a friendly white rat, then violently slammed a hammer against a metal pipe right behind the infant's head over and over until the baby shook with absolute terror at the mere sight of the rat. Or consider Philip Zimbardo's iconic Stanford Prison Experiment. We're always taught that it proves the inherent darkness in human nature, right? But the truth? Zimbardo deliberately coached his guards to be extra brutal and explicitly enforced those dehumanizing rules.
Both of these iconic studies are now widely considered scientifically manipulated garbage that absolutely failed any reasonable ethical standard. Which brings us to Section 5, Fatal Errors in Judgment, Deadly Hubris. We are about to look at the deadliest, most explosive, and reckless mistakes in the entire history of science. The CIA's infamous MKUltra program hoped to explore LSD as a brainwashing agent. The chemist in charge, Sidney Gottlieb, had a habit of casually slipping LSD into his own colleagues' drinks just to see what would happen. He drugged a biological warfare scientist named Frank Olson at a company outing. This triggered a devastating mental breakdown and extreme paranoia in Olson, which tragically culminated in his fatal fall from a hotel window in 1953. This wasn't research, it was an act of pointless sadism masquerading as science by a wildly out-of-bounds chemist. And bizarrely enough, after leaving a massive trail of human misery, Gottlieb just quietly retired and spent his later years working as a middle school speech therapist. No way, right?
Then we have Jack Parsons, who is just a bundle of bizarre contradictions. On one hand, he was a brilliant rocket scientist who literally pioneered solid-state fuel. But on the other hand, he was a self-proclaimed sex wizard, apprenticed to occultist Aleister Crowley, and was actively trying to birth the Antichrist in Los Angeles. Parsons' life was wildly out of control, ultimately costing him his security clearances. This incredible contradiction of a brilliant mind, coupled with an absolute lack of personal safety or boundaries, ended exactly how you might expect. A careless mistake while handling mercury fulminate caused a massive explosion that ended his life at just 37 years old.
So the crucial point is perfectly illustrated by our final story, Louis Slotin and the infamous Demon Core. Slotin was a nuclear physicist working with a massive, highly volatile sphere of plutonium. He liked to show off by performing an experiment he called tickling the dragon's tail, which meant using a simple, everyday flathead screwdriver to prop open a radioactive shield. Literally, everyone warned him it was a terrible idea. He totally ignored them. In 1946, his cowboy arrogance finally caught up with him. His screwdriver slipped. The top deflector fully encased the core, bathing the entire room in a blinding flash of deadly radiation. Slotin died in horrific agony just 9 days later.
Which brings us to our final overarching question. What is the true cost of scientific hubris? Throughout this whole explainer, we've seen brilliant, world-changing minds completely discard logic, reason, and basic self-preservation. From freezing themselves into blue-skinned hypothermia, to sacrificing vulnerable animals, to tickling the dragon's tail with a literal hand tool, it forces us to ask, does the relentless pursuit of knowledge ever truly justify leaving our humanity and our common sense behind? Think about that the next time you hear someone praised simply for being a mad genius. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride, and I'll catch you next time.